This language will incite and encourage the radical left. I'm thinking of Antifa and other organizations like that. It directly threatens the safety of our elected officials and our campaigners. And frankly, in the wake of the Charlie Kirk murder, I think this is an absolute disgrace. I used to think the Prime Minister was a decent man, somebody that I could talk to and chat to. We might disagree on worldview, but I thought he was a profoundly decent human being. I am completely shocked at his behavior. I hope when he wakes up tomorrow morning, he feels ashamed of what he has done. This is a desperate last throw of the dice from a Prime Minister who's in deep trouble, a Prime Minister who can't even command the support of half of his own party. But I'm sorry to say, I now believe that he is unfit to be the Prime Minister of our country.
396 years ago, an English king named Charles triggered a civil war when he dismantled the country's democratic institutions and proceeded to rule as an absolute autocrat. On Monday of this week, the British Prime Minister, who has spent the 15 months of his tenure thus far working to dismantle the country's democratic institutions because he seeks to rule as an absolute autocrat, declared open war on the citizenry of his own country at his party conference, and in one of history's most ironic role reversals, an English king named Charles might be the only man who can stop him. If Britain wasn't already in a constitutional crisis, you bet your sweet butt they are now. It's Wednesday, the 1st of October. This is Curmudgeon's Corner. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where the architectural style has been described as a bit like Balmoral, but probably less obnoxiously German. Good afternoon, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. Welcome to Curmudgeon's Corner. Let's talk about Sir Keir and the Stormtroopers. The Labour Party held their yearly conference a couple of days ago, and our man Sir Keir gave what is probably the most horrifying speech that's ever been delivered by a head of government in a country that is supposed to be a Western liberal democracy. If you handed me a transcript of this speech with the specific references to Britain removed, and you told me it was a Nikita Khrushchev speech from 1953, I would believe you. If you told me it was a speech by the British Prime Minister in the third decade of the 21st century, I would not. Democratic leaders simply do not give speeches like this. Speeches like this are supposed to be the exclusive province of tyrant dictator autocrats in countries that don't have flushing toilets or a reliable electric grid. But here we are. It's a very horrifying speech from top to bottom, but for our present purposes, I want to focus on a couple of the most horrifying excerpts. As I read this first excerpt, which is only one sentence of 16 words in length, ask yourself if there is any conceivable way of interpreting it, except as an explicit threat by the government to wage actual armed conflict against the citizenry for having the wrong opinions. Quote, "We must go into that battle armed not just with words and condemnation, but with action." End quote. And the battle to which he refers is the battle against British citizens who oppose open borders, mass illegal migration, the epidemic of violent crime that accompanies it, and the Islamization of British society, which has already reached such levels of absurdity that just the other day, I saw a video in which a woman waving a British flag in the British capital was surrounded by a mob of angry Muslims waving Palestine flags, and of course the cops arrested the lady with the British flag. But let's give a bit of analysis to that quote. If this isn't a threat by the government to wage actual armed conflict against the citizenry, there simply is no such thing. If you say you're going into battle and you're armed and you plan to take action and you've explicitly stated that you're not referring to a war of words, there is no other possible conclusion except that you want to use actual weapons to cause actual physical harm to those who oppose you. If an ordinary British citizen typed those same words on Facebook, Sir Keir Starmer's government would arrest that person and prosecute them as a domestic terrorist. But Sir Keir thinks he's allowed to talk that way because he has just spent the first part of his speech declaring that anybody who opposes the government's mass migration project is, of course, a fascist, national socialist, racist, Islamophobic bigot. This is Antifa logic. This is the logic that says, because I have applied such and such label to you, because I think your ideas are bad, that means I am now morally obliged to do you physical harm or indeed to take your life. This is the same logic that caused the murder of Charlie Kirk and the assassination attempts on President Trump and the spate of leftist terrorist attacks on federal agents attempting to perform their sworn duties. It is bad enough when those types of attacks are leveled by neck-bearded incel YouTubers. But here we have the Prime Minister of Great Britain trafficking in that same rhetoric. Rhetoric that, in point of fact, would be violative of the terms of service of every social media site and every video sharing platform. Remember when Donald Trump said, "Let's walk over to the Capitol and peacefully and patriotically make our voices heard"? And they said he was inciting a violent insurrection, and all the social media sites immediately banned his account. But here, we have the Prime Minister of the United Goddamn Kingdom openly threatening to wage armed attacks against law-abiding private citizens, and of course, the mainstream fake news media have done nothing but to give him a lusty standing ovation. The BBC and the Guardian and the Daily Mail, the usual suspects, they are all calling it the greatest speech of his career, and that's quite the contrast, isn't it? It's like Sir Keir's version of Churchill's "We shall fight on the beaches" speech, if indeed Churchill had been talking about his government fighting alongside the German invaders toward the subjugation and slavery of the British people. Now here's the second excerpt. Quote, "If you say or simply imply that people cannot be English or British because of the color of their skin, if you now say they should be deported, mark my words, we'll fight you with everything we have because you are the enemy of national renewal." End quote. The Prime Minister of Great Britain just declared that if you want people who ingress your country in contravention of its laws to be removed, as the law demands they must be removed, you are his enemy, and he will fight you with everything he has, which presumably includes the weapons of war. And as far as the bit about national renewal, are we still pretending the Great Replacement is just an unhinged right-wing conspiracy theory? Because this idiot just confirmed it right out loud in public. You call it mass illegal migration, he calls it national renewal. And the first part of that quote is just a load of straw man horse shit. Literally nobody has said that people of certain skin colors can't be English or British. You're just making stuff up, Sir Keir. You are so desperate to smear your government's critics as filthy racist xenophobes, you're putting words in their mouth that they didn't ever say. That is the behavior of a third-rate internet troll, not the head of government of a Western liberal democracy. And even if they had said the thing that you're accusing them of saying, that would not be a valid justification for waging war upon your country's own people. I feel Sir Keir, like many woke leftist douchebags, has a rather dim to non-existent understanding of how free speech works. Because, shocking statement coming, there is nothing illegal about being a racist or a xenophobe, nor is there anything morally objectionable about English people having a preference for being around other English people, or Scots around other Scots, or Welshmen around other Welshmen. Free speech rights don't only apply to speech that you deem fashionable and correct. If you refuse to stand up for the speech rights of people whose views you find abhorrent and repulsive and indefensible, then you don't really care about free speech. It is a simple litmus test, Sir Keir, and you have failed it with flying colors. And so the question is begged, and it is a question that can only be answered by His Britannic Majesty Charles III, by the grace of God, of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and of his other realms and territories, King, head of the Commonwealth, defender of the faith, etc., etc. Does the king enjoy perfect sanguinity with the idea that the head of his government, which rules in his name and by his authority, is threatening to use his armed forces, of which he is the commander-in-chief, to wage open war on his subjects in defense of an unlawful foreign invader? The royal prerogative has been whittled down to almost nothing. In fact, it actually ceased to exist entirely with the passage of the Fixed-Term Parliaments Act of 2011, but it was partially restored by the passage of the Dissolution and Calling of Parliament Act of 2022. But at least in theory, Charles III still has the authority to unilaterally dissolve Parliament by royal decree, just as Charles I did in 1629, and it's only been done one other time since then by William IV in 1835 because he didn't like his Whig prime minister and wanted to have a Tory prime minister instead, specifically his good friend the Duke of Wellington. But William IV was kind of a weirdo, as accidental kings sometimes are. I can't speak for the current king, obviously, but if I were in his position, I would be very much bothered by the idea that my prime minister, who is currently 66 points underwater in the polls, in a desperate last-ditch attempt to remain in power, is openly threatening to use my armed forces to subjugate my people by force of arms. In fact, I think I would have a hell of a big problem with that. What would actually happen if the king attempted to dissolve the present parliament by unilateral royal decree? Well, nobody knows. That's the trouble when your government has no written charter, and your constitution is a dense, impenetrable thicket of many laws passed over the course of many centuries. Sometimes it is impossible to know what the result of a thing would be until you actually do the thing. By tradition and precedent, the monarch is supposed to always refrain from commenting on political matters, much less acting on them at his own volition. But arguably, these are unprecedented times, and an unprecedented situation currently exists. What would happen if such a royal decree were issued? Would it be obeyed? Would it be ignored? Would Sir Keir Starmer place the king under arrest and put him on trial for high treason, just as Cromwell and the boys did with the first King Charles? Would Parliament abolish the monarchy altogether, just as they did? Would they cut off the head of a second King Charles? Would they do the beheading in the English fashion or the Islamic fashion? One can't say with any degree of certainty, but it would certainly be the biggest constitutional crisis of the last 4 centuries, if indeed that crisis doesn't already exist. And each of those outcomes would be, at least, some sort of a possibility. But ever since the restoration of the monarchy, when Charles II was brought home from France and placed on the throne after 11 years of Cromwellian non-kingly rule, the British government has never been so close as it is now to crossing a moral Rubicon that might impel the monarch to decide that, no, damn it, I know I am just supposed to sit down and shut up and sign the papers I'm told to sign and occasionally pass out knighthoods and peerages, but I'm actually not okay with my government using my forces to shoot my people in my name, and I will no longer sit here like a neutered poodle and pretend otherwise. Does the king possess the reserves of moral courage to take a step like that? I can't say, but I hope he does. I'm done, that's all I've got. Thanks for watching, see you next time, God save the king, get off my lawn.